Hello, hello, hello. This is your second video for quantum linguistics. And the first thing I want to talk about is your preparations for the live training. And you will find in section 2 of your manual things that I want you to recap, please. You have presuppositions. Now, this is also a recap from practitioner level. And if you look on page 16 of your manual, you have the full list of presuppositions. So please make sure you know all of those off by heart and you can recognize them freely. Please also learn your Cartesian coordinates, your the 4 pattern. A equals B, not A equals B, A does not equal B, not A but not B. So your Cartesian coordinates, please know it off by heart. Also, it would be really useful if you prepare for symbolic logic. And this is on page 21 of your manual. And this is how we learn to understand how certain words indicate certain things. So, for example, ands and ors. So ors we normally recognize as inclusive or exclusive ors. And start to think about what it means when you put these particular phrases in sentences and what it actually does to the meaning. Then, if you look on page 22, you can start to understand inductive or deductive language. This also helps us to understand the perception of a client. There will be some things that people have very deductive thinking in and other things people have inductive thinking in. I'm also interested for your feedback and your thoughts on what inductive language can often identify in a client. Okay. Next, I want you to consider the prepositions, and I do mean prepositions rather than the presuppositions. Prepositions you will find on page 29, and we start to look again at what adding these words into sentences actually indicates in terms of meaning. What are the possibilities? Also, have a look at modal operators. Make sure that you understand these 6 different categories. Make sure that you have 3 or 4 from each category in your head, because it's really useful when you're trying to do rapid reframing. Okay, so Meta Model 3 I'm going to demonstrate live in class, and actually all of the techniques we will do one after the other live in class. However, if you know all of your language, your basic structure of language from section 2 of the manual, then it will make the techniques very, very easy and they will slip into your mind with ease and you can start using them straight away. So all of the patterns will be worked on live, and I mentioned those in the first presentation. Okay, so what I really want to be talking about today is I want you to get you thinking about cognitive distortions and whether or not we can point out to our clients that their thinking is outdated or there is a different way to think. And thinking is something that we all struggle with. We all have problems thinking. And these issues that we have with ourselves, with other people, with situations, tend to be in a bit of an invisible realm prior to and above, or meta to, the actual thinking itself. So what that means is the area of specific conflict or tension or stress or difference actually involves our thinking patterns. And ideally, we want to get people to feel more empowered with their thinking rather than thinking that their thinking controls them. So how we're actually thinking rather than what we're actually thinking is the issue. And obviously, we have content reframes, and I'll talk about that more in another presentation. And yet, the first thing we really want to get into our heads is the structure of our thinking. How are we actually thinking? And how we think manifests in the experience that we have. So we want to ask ourselves some questions. So what controls and determines the way that we think in the first place? And what is actually governing or controlling the style and the mode of thinking prior to the moment that we actually think? So how are we sorting information? And then how can we really understand those different thinking structures or thinking styles? And what can we do with them? So our thinking style exists at a level that is above our thinking. It's meta to our thinking. And obviously you're familiar with the term meta programs, which we're going to be going through in our second week. And these are effectively the filters that our thinking goes through before it becomes a thought. So our ideas go through these styles or these programs before we actually have a thought about a specific thing. So, just as an example, we may pay attention to a tiny detail, or we may pay attention to the big picture and forget all of the details. And obviously, in a meta-program format, this would be whether or not we are global or specific. However, it's so much more than that. And to really understand how to step above the client's thinking and how to start to reframe it and how to find an actual model for us to run in our heads so that we have a process to follow, then we want to start thinking at a meta level. We want to start helping the client as well to think above their thoughts. Now, I mentioned earlier that all of us have issues thinking all the time. It's something that we want to work on a daily basis almost, or certainly a weekly basis, or certainly a review basis with the people that we work with and we bounce our ideas off, because it's so easy for us to misrepresent, have a misunderstanding, not really, based on an idea, you can make a judgment about a person and you can take a gesture in a very different way to the way it was intended. And, that's just one way in which we might generalize our experience or we might distort our experience. And once we've distorted it and once we've planted that thought, it's very, very difficult to step outside of that thought and see a different way. So the work that we do with quantum linguistics relates very much to all the work we've done before with presuppositions, with a meta model. And effectively what we're doing is really looking at the structure of how something is formed and then understand how we can break it. And that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, so let's go back to the meta model. If you remember, the meta model is DDG, deletions, distortions, and generalizations. And today, what I want to look at is generalizations and distortions. So this is quite an interesting way to break it down. You may want to take some notes. I found these ideas really, really useful for me. So let's start with overgeneralizing. This is where we jump to conclusions without much evidence, or we naturally assume that we've seen this situation before. We don't necessarily have the facts, and we just naturally jump to conclusion. Any of you who have read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell will know that it is almost impossible to stop the initial judgment that we make as human beings. What we're doing when we're building relationships is we're unpacking that initial judgment. And this is also obviously what we're doing with NLP. This is what we're doing with quantum linguistics. We're looking at different ways that we can question each different filter or structure. So overgeneralizing is number one. The second one, there are only three in generalization. The second one in generalization is all or nothing thinking. You'll notice I talked a lot about black and white thinking in the first video. And this kind of extreme or polarity or polarized thinking of it has to be one way or the other and it's mutually exclusive is really, really common in certain value sectors. It's also really common or values levels, it's also really common when people are scared or they have just had a trauma. Because actually, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this or if you've ever known anyone that this has happened to, often when people have traumas, they go back to a structure a long way from the past. So for example, a lot of people will rediscover religion because religion is a beautifully black and white thinking, and it's terribly safe because you know exactly what is right and exactly what is wrong. And this is where, you know, people who have extreme stress in their life can often go back to find a family structure or a religious structure or a governmental structure or some kind of structure that is extremely polarized because it feels very safe and the safety level matches the trauma level. Okay. And the other one is where the all or nothing thinking is where you've got two valued choices that are directly opposite from one another. You know, it's really good living in the city, and I know it's really healthy to live in the country. So initially, you'd look at this as two parts, and yet we might even be able to flip this with language, just by questioning the rest in the most appropriate way. Okay, the third generalization is labeling or name calling, and this is where we group people into certain categories. You may have noticed that as fear builds in, well, across the world actually, we love a label, we love a category. And then we like to put categories on walls, and then we like to say, well, that person is that person, and this person is this person, and that means that about them. And talking of meaning, generalization is the really interesting from this point of view, because the question that we want to know is, wow, so what does that actually mean to you? What does it mean if you're that category or if that person's that category? What does that mean if that's wrong? Because we're really trying to understand how this person organizes meaning in their thinking. So what is the impact of overgeneralizing, of jumping to conclusion? And then we can go above it. Well, what's the purpose of that? Well, quite often it might be safety. And one of those sort of reptilian brain requirements, overgeneralizing could be for a number of different reasons, just because we don't want to take up more space in our brain. So think about this as you start to go through this process and think about, okay, what could actually a specific overgeneralization mean? And as you listen to your clients speaking, as you're doing your case studies and finishing off your case studies, really start to listen to their language and understand the categorization and what it means to them. Okay, so now let's look at patterns of distortion, of which there are many, many more. So the first one is blaming. And obviously, blaming is very, very close to victimization. And I talked about that yesterday. One of the things that's really important for making a change or stepping forward is the release of victimization. And accusing other people. The blame game happens when we're exhibiting values level 2 issues or rejection or even high acceptance. Because in a tribal mindset, it is never really your fault. It's somebody else's fault. And this wants to be questioned closely. And also understanding what could cause somebody to choose to blame that person. Okay, the obvious answer is ease. And yet there may also be some meta-level representations about the context that blaming happens within, etc., etc., etc. Okay, the next one is mind reading. This is so, so common. And, actually, let me just step back a moment, because what I wanted to also say about blaming is this taking responsibility issue is really interesting on a personal level. So, for example, let's put it in the context of illness. Actually, many people have an awareness that something's wrong before they know they're ill or before they've been diagnosed. And it's really interesting how we have the safety mechanism within us which prevents us from going to find the information or going out to find the information or the diagnosis, just in case it's something that we're terribly scared of. And this, I mean, I've just given you one context of illness. This obviously can happen in every context of our lives. And responsibility is generally actually either a fear of failure or a fear of the power, actually, a fear of knowing that actually we are capable of making a difference if we choose. Okay, mind reading, also very common. So pretending to know how people feel, and what's often happening here is that we are looking for a third party to validate our beliefs. So often mind reading shows a lack of trust of self. And it's really good to understand, okay, what would cause somebody to make that assumption? Mind reading is most common in the people that we have had the most intimate relationships with, people we've lived with for years, whether that's roommates, whether that's partners. Mind reading is really, really common, and it's good to check it all the time. Prophesizing, yes. This is really interesting, and this sort of, I love a good conspiracy theory. I enjoy hunting YouTube and finding them. However, it fascinates me how this projection of negative outcomes has now moved out of the kind of weird and wonderful media. Well, it hasn't moved out of it, it's still there. The world will come to an end, you know, Doomsday Book, Nostradamus, all that malarkey. It hasn't ended, it's so interesting how it's filtered into mainstream media. And how, you know, 15 years ago, when I worked in an office, and one of my colleagues used to read the Daily Mail, and we had a Daily Mail voice, which was basically the doom and gloom voice, in which we amused ourselves reading headlines in this ridiculous voice. And yet it's everywhere now. You know, everything's terrible, everything is, it's kind of expanding this idea of prophesizing and suggesting that things are just going to be terrible. The other thing that interests me in this section is the idea that prophesizing can also be, people talk about the energetic shift, people talk about planetary alignment. Actually, the likelihood of, let's say let's take, for example, the idea of fifth dimension, or the leap from third dimension to fifth dimension, which many people confuse with 3G to 5G. People have this idea that it's got to involve something terrible, or that we're all suddenly going to become energetic beings. And yet, that for me holds no logic, because change happens all the time. Every now is a new now, and it's a change now from the now a moment ago. So we are always changing, and in some moments we change dramatically, and in other moments we just change at a pace that is normal to ourselves, or referenced by our own rate of change, I guess. And yet there's a lot of sort of negative ideas about the fact that, you know, the earth is changing, and this will sort of create monstrous natural disasters. And obviously there's the people suggesting that we'll be hit by a meteor, and as a result there'll be dramatic change and flooding, and then potentially a new ice age. So that's nice. It's so interesting that the prophesizing and this projection sits so beautifully in the generalizations, the black and white, the polarized perspective. And that really interests me because it's very much connected to that in my world. Now, emotionalizing. So this is really sort of taking into account our emotions as a source of reality. Now, this is an interesting one for me. As you know, I'm a great believer in gut feeling. However, some really exciting things can sometimes feel terribly scary in your gut. And it's really important to balance our feelings or to rationalize our feelings and say, oh, actually, what was that? What was that all about, that feeling? So this emotionalizing situation that people often do, and it happens a lot with fear and anxiety. And I agree. I had an acupuncturist staying with us a couple of months ago, and he said to me, I'm so sick of hearing the word stress. It means absolutely nothing. He said, I'm interested in actually what somebody's feeling. However, we have got so used to the idea that stress is a thing that really it's just another dissociation from our emotions. So when somebody is in an extreme or a polarity, so when they are over-emotionalizing, quite often that is the way they have learnt to think about their emotions, and it's the way that they have learnt to express it, and it will often be with a generic term like stress or anxiety or fear. Okay, so personalizing. So this is where we take everything that everyone else does personally, without assuming that actually the person may not have considered us at all. It may have absolutely nothing to do with us. This is very, very common as well, and it's really common with people who are exhibiting values level 2 behavior and values level 3 because we have paranoia. Okay, now the next one is awfulizing. I love this word. I'm not sure it's a real word actually. This is where we assume that the absolute worst possible outcome could occur. And you'll hear people say this is awful, or this is dreadful, or this is terrible. It's very easy to do. I've bought into this myself in the past quite frequently. And you know when you've shifted from this because it feels different. It's not as if things that happen that are deeply sad or terrible or unfair or unjust, you feel them. It's just that you look at it from a meta perspective rather than assuming that everything is awful. Let me give you an example. Last New Year's Eve, there was a Labrador in a cage, and I'm assuming, since I know New Year's Eve in Sri Lanka, that the Labrador was barking crazily because most people set off 1 million fireworks and firecrackers. So I should imagine that dog was barking loudly, and some non-sentient human, in their infinite wisdom, decided to cover the dog in kerosene and set fire to it. Now, this is obviously awful, dreadful, inhumane, and yet it sparked a wave of isn't this awful in so many people that I know. And it really is awful. And so are all the other things that happen to dogs in Asian countries. You know, they're hung by their neighbours if they bark too loud. There's all sorts of inhumane behaviour that occurs based on the values level of the people living in that society. So again, this goes back to what I talked about in video 1. This goes back to how much are you willing to allow something awful or irritating or worrying or distressing to hijack your energy. It's the same with loss, with grief. How much are you willing to let it hijack your energy? more importantly, how are you willing to let it hijack your thinking? Okay, the shoulding. You see this so frequently in European societies, which are hugely, or can be hugely, judgmental. There's a lot of right way, there's a lot of wrong way, there's a lot of decorum. You also see this in the more evolved Asian societies like Japan, because there are ways that you should, have to, must, ought to do things. The shoulding, we've learnt with meta-model questioning how to release the shoulding, and I'm also putting it in this category. Okay, now, as we start to look at the general filters that we have, we start to wonder how it is that we can notice one thing over another thing in a certain situation. So let's say, for example, there are 12 people sitting in a restaurant. How is it possible that somebody's attention is drawn to the behavior of just one person in that restaurant, excluding everyone else in that situation? And this filtering is really interesting and something that is worthy of questioning. So how is it, and we know this, I mean, I give this example several times. You go to the theatre, you go to the cinema, everyone comes out with a different perception of what happened, or how it sounded, or how it felt, or what they thought of the visual effects, or whatever it was. And sometimes by over-focusing on one tiny facet of a situation, it creates a negative perception. Okay, so these are the patterns of distortion and generalizations. Oh yes, the cantings. Sorry, I'd forgotten to the cantings. The can't. Now, obviously, don't have the resources, I'm not good enough, are two of the major sort of problem sides that people can have. The canting can also relate to the shoulding. Ooh, I can't do that. Or it can be, I don't have the resources to do that. I can't possibly give up my job and move there. That would be outrageous. So canting is related to shoulding, and it's also related to resources. And then the last one, last but not least, lucky number 13, my favourite, is disqualifying possible solutions. Now, depending on where you are, and depending on where your client is, there are times when you may just hold working with a client, and you may go and set them some tasking. Because if they operate from a place where they're discounting every possible solution, you could use some of your best linguistic magic and spend a lot of time working with them. And you could actually support them in facilitating a shift. The question is it worth your time? And are there other people who are more ripe for change, and they have more intention and desire for change? So discounting can always be challenged, and it's a really good way when you start challenging that of understanding if somebody has a large amount of resistance or if they're actually ready for change. Good. Okay, so good question. How do we actually shift it? How do we shift this thinking pattern? We've got, 13 and 3. So there are 16 different categories or types of thinking, or thinking programs that we've talked about in the last few slides. And I want to present to you a pattern that you can use before I talk to you about how you can actually lead people into more empowered thinking. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is you are going to identify the cognitive distortions, and you're going to start to think about what is the difficulty here? What is stopping somebody from thinking about this in a different way? And once you have listed out your cognitive distortions, just check the list and try it on yourself. See what you think about it. And then identify all the ones that actually create difficulties for you or for another person. So as you look at the list of 16 thinking patterns that we've just gone through, and obviously you can go back on the video, just ask yourself, do I do any of these? Do I have a predisposition to operate any of these patterns? And then start to think about, if you do, actually how you can solve that. So think about the cognitive distortions, and I'm doing this with you right now because you're going to be doing this with your client. We'll also do it live in class. But reflect on the cognitive distortions and then mirror them back to the client. And you can say to a client, wow, that's so interesting, because it seems that pretty much everything is awfulizing or awful in your life. Could that really be true? Could everything be awful? Or actually, is there one higher level of awful thing that is then flooding down through the rest of your experience, and you're perceiving everything else as awful? So this is where we start to really directly question exactly what the client has just said. So we're taking those cognitive distortions and we're questioning them. Then you really want to, you're starting to warm somebody up to a meta perspective. So you might say, well, look, just step back from that a moment. Is it really that awful in the grand scheme of things? Is it really, really that bad? Could there be anything positive about it? Then you'll notice what you're doing here, either with yourself or with a client. Ask yourself, how would you characterize this thought pattern? Maybe ask your client how they'd characterize this thought pattern. So when you think of that kind of thinking, does it remind you of somebody you know? Does it personify in any way? What do you think about that type of thinking? So you're really starting to build responsibility within the client, and obviously we do it ourselves, with this kind of thinking. And you start them on a trail of, oh, okay, maybe it's not me. Maybe that's not my thinking. Maybe that's a habit. Remember, we are all patterns and habits. So breaking the pattern is often a really important part of releasing the habit. Okay, number 3, we are really going to bring the client up to the meta position, the higher level, to look down upon it. So, does this type of thinking actually reflect the one that you usually use? Is it helpful? And then you start to say, okay, well, how long have you actually used this distortion for sorting through all of your things? And do you think this cognitive distortion, or obviously you may refer to it as something else, do you think this perspective or this awful perspective has served you well in any way? And if it has served you well, then how? Let's talk about that. Okay, good. And do you think there's any way that it may have actually undermined you or your sense of well-being, or it may have caused you to process your surroundings or your experience inaccurately? And if so, what could be a more useful way of processing this information, and how would you like to do it? How would you prefer to process this information? What perspective would you like to have? Okay, then you're going to challenge the distortion. So, just out of interest, and you ask your client quite literally, just out of interest, if this were your best friend and she was telling you that, or she or he were telling you that everything in their life were awful, how would you argue against that in a discussion with them? This is effectively a perceptual position. It's a linguistic perceptual position. So what would you say? How are these ways of thinking inaccurate or not accurate? And then as you think about these cognitive patterns, and just say, well, look, do you think that thinking in the old way is empowering you to change the way that you deal with them, or manage them effectively for you, or manage them in a way that feels good? There may be some resistance to this as you do it. So the quicker that you can actually challenge the distortion, the more likely you are to get an unconscious or a more honest answer, or you're going to be able to identify what the real issue is that's filtering that thinking. And then you invite the client by saying, so if you were to think about it this way or that way, how much does it change the influence or the power of that awfulizing or that awful perspective or that cognitive distortion, however you want to present it? Good. Okay. So these are the first 4 steps of the pattern. The last step, step number 5, is to replace the cognitive distortions with empowering thinking patterns. Now, I'm about to give you a list of different thought patterns which may well be helpful for you when you're working with clients. And what we're really interested to know is, as you read through them, ask yourself, try them on for you, which one of these give you a more empowering way to think and perceive? By doing that, if you get comfortable with 3 or 4 of them and you keep them in your mind, when you're working with clients, you can throw them out there and say, okay, well, what if you thought about them this way? What if you thought about your situation in that way? Would that be helpful? Would that allow you to feel more positive? Okay, ask yourself which ones transform the mind and the emotions. And then you're going to select your 3, 4, 5, learn all of them by all means. For me, I found that learning 3 or 4 was really helpful, and then having them to throw about in a way that feels really comfortable for me, in a way that I'm very connected to, I found that really empowering. Okay, so the question is, how? And here it is. So the first one is contextual thinking. So you've done this before because we've done context reframe. So say, okay, so you're thinking about this particular awful situation in the context of your work. And then you want to build details around that. So you want all of your 5 W's. And then you want to challenge any unspecified nouns, any verbs, unfreeze any normalizations, and any relational terms, so where one thing means another thing, also challenge that. So this is the first approach, contextual thinking. The second one is a duality, really. It's both and thinking. So this is how we really run a reality test for the client to assess whether the situation really runs as a set of choices. And if not, we look at it in a very linear way so that we are using time. We're looking at it as continuous motion. And if somebody has polarities, then we start saying, really? So is there really black or white? I mean, in every context? Is it really possible that there's only right or wrong? And then you start challenging that with questions. And then you ask whether or not these particular polarities represent or are different in different contexts, in different circumstances. So is it okay to kill someone who attacked you, even though it's wrong to kill? Even if you had no intention of killing them, is that still wrong? So you start to put together scenarios that break the polarity. Okay, third one, again, is a reality testing. And you can ask that very simply in the first instance by saying, really? Is that true? Is that absolutely true? Are you sure? Wow, that's incredible. So every single time we're just trying to break the reality of the person. We're getting them to shake their frame so there's an option for a new frame. Okay, number 4, denominalizing thinking. So this is about denominalization. So we're asking how a label functions, and obviously this breaks the labeling, the generalization of labeling. So we unfreeze the nominalization. So let's say we've got a nominalization of partition. The verb that creates partition could be to part, to separate. It could be a number of different ones. Yeah, or to put in 2 parts. And we start to unfreeze everything so that the energy of their language starts flowing again. And anything that we think is distorting their language, we unfreeze it and we check it back. Number 5, we operate systematic thinking. And what we do is we reality test to determine the cause of the pattern. So what is actually causing it? So we may need to use time to look at this. We may need to understand all of the events that led to that. And also, if there are, we need to sort of push back to the client and demonstrate that every situation is multifaceted. It has multi-opportunities. It has multiple options. Okay, next one, information gathering thinking. So this is where we start to, in detail, ask the client more about how they felt about that. What was their intuition? Did their intuition tell them it was going to be as bad as it actually turned out to be? And we start to really understand what's impacting the distortion. Okay, number 7. Predictive thinking. So we're going to start gathering high quality information about all the different factors, causes, forces, and trends that came together to create the phenomenon or the event that the person is talking about. And also start looking at consequences of certain actions. So just question. Say, okay, so what really would happen if you changed your approach to that? What would be the outcome? And they should come up, or they could come up with 4, 5, 6 different solutions. Just start to try and understand exactly what is filtering this person's belief to create this thinking, and then test different ways of presenting either a different filter in the first place, or see how they react to a different outcome. Okay, number 8, critical thinking and meta thinking. So as we start to think more about the fact there are so many different causes for any given situation, then we present that to the client. We say, okay, well, there's so many different variables that could have actually contributed to this situation. So let's really start to backtrack, and let's really start to understand exactly how those emotions came about. This is quite an interesting approach because it's almost like the opposite of a drop down through. It's like a linguistic rise. So what you're really asking somebody is to consider the filtering process and say, okay, so really what contributed to that feeling of awful? Okay, good. So how were you feeling at the time, just before the awful? And was it a word trigger? Was it one word that somebody said? Was it the entire sentence? Was it the look on the person's face? Was it the tone of voice they used? Or was it the information? Was it the content of the presentation that really created the awful? So we start to sort of backtrack to understand the path towards this. And guess what? It's almost really similar to a strategy, because we're sort of unpacking the process. Then you can start to question different elements of the pattern, the process, the structure, and the content. Okay, number 9. We start to reality test the shoulds. You know how to do this because we did it in practitioner level. Well, who says you should? And how is it you know that that is the right way? Or how is it that you know that you should? When did you decide that? Now, if somebody resists the should because they have very, very strict rules in their head around this, then you can also say, okay, well, what would be different is rather than saying, I should do that, how would it feel if you acknowledge that you prefer to do that or that you'd like to do that? So obviously what we're doing is we're offering up the concept of choice here, which obviously links to responsibility. Okay. Next one. Number 10. So when people personalize everything, obviously we want to help them to dissociate their thinking so that they can actually separate other people's behavior from their own. So the quickest way to do that is to test the content and to test the context, and to understand if this only happens with certain people or if it happens with everyone, or if it's a result of paranoia, often common in values level 2 or 3. And what we do is we start to code that information. Hang on, let me step back from that. What we start to do is we almost put it in perceptual positions, and we can either use perceptual positions in this instance and say, well, wow, that's interesting. So how about I'm going to be you for a minute and you're going to be me? And you actually get them to run through that role. So this is a really powerful technique. Or you get them to do it with their best friend. Say, okay, so if your best friend came to you and said this, what would you think? Would you think she or he was reasonable in their thinking? Does it sound positive? Does it sound useful? Is it a helpful way to think? Could there be any other possibility? Okay. Perceptual positions linguistically. Possibility thinking. Obviously, this is such a brilliant way to transform the can'ts to the cans. And we do this all the time with our language. And you can, and you know you can, and you will do, and you choose to, and you can now. Great. Can you do that? Can you choose to feel happy about that? So we use all of our possibility language. So anything from our modal operators of possibility, we switch out can'ts and we replace them with cans. And we also make suggestions with mights, possibly, wouldn't it be wonderful? What would happen if? Could you imagine a life like that? How would you feel? Good. Okay, so this is possibility thinking. And we have one more, which is effectively gratitude or appreciative thinking. So what we're really asking is, wow, how could we consider that a gift? How could we consider that situation a blessing? How could we consider it to be an opportunity? How could we think of it as something really empowering and wonderful for us to do something with it? It's gratitude. And gratitude, again, is so, so powerful. It's so much more than affirmations. It's a feeling right now of, wow, I am so deeply grateful for everything in my world. And if we get into the habit of noticing it when we feel it rather than trying to be grateful, that may sound really strange. It's just there are moments throughout your day where you'll see something or you'll hear something and you'll think, oh yeah, that's great, or you just feel that feeling of gratitude. Get into the habit of noticing that rather than working to present gratitude all the time, because if you can capture those moments of what I call real gratitude and have them in your awareness, then you can also use them for anchoring, for goal setting, and generally to feel really good about everything. Okay, so there are your 12 solutions for empowered thinking. So, what I really want you to take away from this is the fact that all of us have problems thinking, and it's just the human condition. All of us will make mistakes, we all have limitations, irrationality, and we don't suddenly become perfect people just because we understand. We just become people who understand and then are better trained to acknowledge our own behavior. We, at some point or another, can all expect our emotions or ambition or drive or impulses to get in the way of clear thinking. I always used to think, my goodness, I'll sleep on that and then I'll see what I think. And I never really understood my purpose for doing it. And I think now I feel that I always want to make decisions when I'm full of food. Making decisions when I'm hungry has never proved positive for me. I like to have eaten, I like to have slept, I like to have planned out my solution, and then I like to sleep and then wake up and decide what I think. So just giving yourself some space, whether it's thinking at the meta level, whether it's taking some time to sleep, whether it's making sure that you're in a good physical state, always remember it's good to take a step back and look at our own thinking. There will be every week, every day even, thinking of ours which is unclear or unhelpful. The more aware we become, we can step back and we can engage in meta thinking. And this is for us more important really than the client, because the more we operate in the meta level, the more able we are to see things clearly. And from this higher perceptual position, we can feel more ecological, or we can decide whether a situation is actually ecological. We can do reality testing, we can quality control our thinking, and we can identify when actually we have had entirely inaccurate thinking, which is also possible on a daily or even weekly basis. It's good to check, it's good to take a step back, and this is also the main reason that I believe that rest, taking time, and breathing, meditating, having fun with friends, whatever it might be, relaxing, is so, so important. The other thing that I want to mention at this point is that overthinking can be deeply, deeply unhelpful. And when I say overthinking, specifically I'm talking about overthinking a problem. One of the major issues that clients of psychoanalysis report is the fact that the more they think about the past and how much of a problem it was, the worse it feels. So a lot of the work that we're doing, even though we go into it in detail in training, we're looking to change as quickly as possible. So however you choose to reframe, even if you only ever use the same reframe, it's better to know a few off by heart so you can deliver them quickly and you can change that frame seamlessly and with speed. And remember, it's all about space, time, matter, and energy. We are always, always filtering our experience through these categories. Listen for the language, you have the skills. And I'm very excited to work through all of the exercises with you. That is the end of video number 2 for quantum linguistics, and as ever, email me if you have any questions, or if there's anything you didn't understand or can't find in the manual. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.